A bustling café was filled with lively chatter when an audacious young woman's voice cut through the air. "Coward," she spat, glaring at a quiet man seated nearby. The man, a reserved figure in his late 30s, merely sipped his coffee, unbothered. But when she jabbed at his military jacket, questioning his worth, he calmly stood, removed it, and turned to reveal something that left everyone in stunned silence. The air grew heavy with regret, awe, and a truth no one expected. The cafe was alive with the hum of conversation and the clatter of cups. The autumn chill had driven many inside, seeking warmth in the company of strangers and the comfort of hot drinks. Emily stepped through the door, her scarf pulled tight around her neck, her mood as brisk as the air outside. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a man by the window. His worn military jacket stood out, faded but unmistakable, its patches a silent testament to service. She felt a spark of irritation, a knee-jerk reaction rooted in years of listening to her father's tirades against the military. War isn't bravery, he'd always say. It's a failure of humanity, a playground for those who can't solve their problems with reason. Those words had shaped her, cementing a skepticism she rarely questioned. To her, uniforms were symbols of a flawed system, and those who wore them either didn't know better or, worse, embraced it. The sight of the man, so composed and unassuming, lit a fire she couldn't explain. Emily ordered her latte, her eyes flicking back to the man. He seemed oblivious to the world around him, his gaze fixed on the street outside. He wasn't even drinking his coffee. It sat in front of him, cooling, untouched. Something about his stillness irritated her. Was it arrogance? Indifference? She couldn't tell, but the longer she watched, the more it gnawed at her. When her drink was ready, she moved deliberately to a table closer to him. She told herself it was coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. She wanted to understand why he bothered her so much. As she sat, she noticed the details of his jacket, the patches, the insignias, the wear and tear that spoke of years of use. To someone else, it might have been a badge of honor. To her, it was a provocation. The irritation grew. He wasn't old, maybe in his late 30s with dark hair peppered with gray. What could he have possibly been through? He looked too young to have seen anything of consequence, and yet here he was, wearing that jacket like it meant something. She felt her thoughts spiral, each one feeding her frustration until she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the cafe's background noise. He didn't respond. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me." The man turned, his expression calm but curious. "Yes." Her heart raced, but she pressed on, her voice firm. "That jacket. Do you really think it's appropriate to wear something like that? Sitting here, drinking coffee, acting like you've done something worth respecting?" The cafe grew quieter. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The man's expression didn't change. He looked at her as if he were weighing her words, deciding whether they deserved a response. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his tone polite but edged with steel. "Have I offended you?" Emily bristled at his calmness. "It's not about me. That jacket, it's not just a piece of clothing. It represents something. Sacrifice, courage. And here you are, flaunting it like it's some kind of costume. Do you even know what it means to wear something like that?" The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. For a moment he said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Do you?" The question caught her off guard. "I know enough," she said quickly. "My father always said that people who wear those uniforms are just looking for an excuse to glorify war. And here you are, sitting here like some kind of hero. It's disrespectful." A murmur rippled through the cafe. Some patrons looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched with open curiosity. An older man at the counter shook his head but said nothing. The man took a deep breath and stood. He moved deliberately, unbuttoning his jacket. Emily watched, her irritation giving way to unease. When he removed the jacket, the café fell silent. The left sleeve of his shirt was pinned neatly at the shoulder. His prosthetic arm rested on the table, its metallic surface catching the light. Scars crisscrossed his visible arm, faint but unmistakable. A small tattoo on his wrist caught her eye, a series of names etched in delicate script. He turned to face her fully, his gaze steady. "This jacket isn't about glorifying war," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "It's about remembering the people who didn't come back, people I knew, people I fought beside." He gestured to the tattoo on his wrist. "These are their names. They're the reason I'm still here." Emily's breath caught. The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave, washing away her indignation, leaving only shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her cheeks burned as she looked around the café, seeing the judgment in the eyes of those watching. But the worst part wasn't their judgment. It was the quiet dignity of the man standing before her. I'm sorry," she managed to whisper. The man nodded, his expression softening. "Maybe next time. Think before you speak." With that, he picked up his jacket and walked out, leaving Emily standing there, her latte untouched, her heart heavy with regret. The air outside the café was crisp, sharpening every breath. Emily didn't move from her seat for several minutes after the man left. She stared at the door, his words echoing in her mind. Around her, the café slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but she felt the occasional glance from other patrons. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, making her feel small and exposed. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her trance. It was a text from Clara, her best friend. "Hey, how's your morning? Lunch later?" Emily didn't respond. She couldn't focus on lunch, not after what had just happened. She kept replaying the man's calm demeanor, his quiet but cutting words. How had she let her assumptions push her into such a confrontation? "Why did I say that?" she whispered, running her hands through her hair. She wasn't usually like this. Sure, she had strong opinions, but she wasn't cruel, or so she thought. But today, something about him had struck a nerve. Was it his jacket? The way he seemed so at peace? Or was it something deeper, something she didn't want to admit? Grabbing her bag, she left the café, her untouched latte still sitting on the table. The cold air hit her as she stepped outside, but she barely noticed. She wandered the streets aimlessly, trying to process everything. The encounter played on a loop in her mind. His calm gaze, the scars on his arm, the names tattooed on his wrist. Those names haunted her. Who were they? What had happened to them? And why had she felt the need to attack someone who had clearly endured so much? Her feet carried her to a park near her apartment. It was a place she often went to clear her head, though today, clarity felt impossible. The trees were shedding their last leaves, and children's laughter rang out as they played tag and ran through piles of leaves. Emily sat on a bench, her scarf pulled tight around her neck, and watched them. Their carefree joy was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She thought of her father, of his strong, unyielding opinions about war and those who fought it. His voice had been so loud, so convincing. She'd never questioned it. But now, those convictions felt hollow. She pulled out her phone and typed "military jacket patches meaning" into the search bar. A flood of results appeared, and she clicked on one at random. The article explained the symbolism of different patches: rank, unit, battles fought. Each one told a story of service, sacrifice, and loss. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the images, realizing how much she didn't know. One patch on the man's jacket stood out in her memory, a shield with a lightning bolt running through it. She found it in the article and read the description. Special Forces, elite units trained for the most dangerous missions. Her stomach churned. She had accused a man who might have been part of one of the most demanding branches of the military of pretending to be a hero. Her thoughts spiraled. What if he had lost his arm on a mission? What if those names tattooed on his wrist were his team, his friends, the people he had fought beside? Her words from earlier echoed in her mind, sharp and unkind. Do you even know what it means to wear something like that? She hadn't known. She still didn't fully know. But she had spoken as if she did, as if her opinion was the only one that mattered. The guilt was suffocating. She felt an urgent need to apologize, but the man was gone. She didn't even know his name. The tattoo might have been a clue, but she hadn't looked closely enough to remember the names. She cursed herself for her carelessness. Scrolling again on her phone, she searched for veteran support groups in the city. If he was local, maybe he was connected to one. It was a long shot, but it was all she could think of. The search brought up a list of organizations, and she clicked on the first one. Its website featured upcoming events, including a meeting at a community center just a few blocks from her apartment later that week. Emily hesitated. Was it really her place to show up? She didn't want to intrude, but the thought of leaving things unresolved was unbearable. Maybe he wouldn't be there, but at least it was a step. She could learn more, understand more. For the first time, she felt a genuine need to break out of the narrow lens through which she had viewed the world. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Her usual routines felt meaningless. She tried reading a book, but her mind wandered back to the café. She turned on the TV, but the noise only made her feel more restless. By the time she crawled into bed that night, her mind was still racing. She stared at the ceiling, his words replaying over and over. He hadn't yelled at her. He hadn't lashed out. He had simply shown her the truth, and it had shaken her to her core. As she lay there, she thought about what the man must have gone through. The loss, the pain, the scars he carried both inside and out. And then she thought about herself, about how easy it had been to judge him without knowing his story. The beliefs she had carried for so long now felt fragile, cracks forming under the weight of new questions. Who had she become? And who did she want to be? She didn't have the answers yet, but as her eyes grew heavy and she drifted into sleep, one thought stood out above the rest. She couldn't leave this unfinished. She had to find him, and she had to make it right. Emily woke up early the next day, her resolve crystallizing. She couldn't shake the encounter from her mind. It felt like an open wound that demanded closure. She knew it wouldn't be easy to find the man again, but she had to try. If he wasn't at the upcoming veteran support group meeting, she'd keep searching until she could look him in the eye and apologize. After finishing her breakfast, Emily sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, scrolling through more information about veterans, military service, and organizations in her city. The details she uncovered painted a picture far removed from the simplistic negative narrative she'd clung to for so long. Article after article spoke of the sacrifices veterans made, not just on the battlefield, but in their daily lives afterward. She felt a pang of guilt every time she read about the stigma they faced or the challenges of reintegration into civilian life. These were things she had never even considered before. She bookmarked the website for the support group meeting and made a mental note of the address. It was a small community center, a short bus ride away. The meeting wasn't until the following evening, so she had time to prepare herself. But what would she say if he was there? How could she possibly make up for the things she had said? The next day at work was a blur. Her focus was non-existent, her thoughts consumed by the man's face, his scars, and the names tattooed on his wrist. Every time she tried to work, she'd find herself picturing the way he had calmly removed his jacket, forcing her to confront the truth she had ignored. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but she brushed off their concerns with a tight smile and vague excuses. When the clock finally struck 5, she packed up her things and headed straight home. The meeting was at 7, and she wanted to make sure she arrived on time. She changed into a simple outfit, a plain sweater and jeans, hoping to blend in. As the bus approached the community center, her nerves began to kick in. What if he wasn't there? Or worse, what if he was, and he didn't want to hear from her? The small building was tucked between a row of shops, its exterior modest and unassuming. Emily hesitated outside the door, her palms sweating. She could hear faint voices inside, a murmur of conversation that felt warm and welcoming. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small but inviting, with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a table at the back offering coffee and pastries. About a dozen people were scattered around the room, chatting quietly. Some wore military jackets like the man she had met, while others were dressed in casual clothes. A woman near the door greeted Emily with a warm smile. "First time here?" she asked. Emily nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Yeah, I just wanted to learn more about what you do here." The woman handed her a flyer. "We're a support group for veterans and their families. Feel free to sit in, listen, or share if you'd like. There's no pressure." Emily thanked her and took a seat near the edge of the circle, her eyes scanning the room nervously. She didn't see the man, but that didn't mean he wasn't coming. She forced herself to focus as the meeting began, with attendees taking turns introducing themselves and sharing updates about their lives. Some spoke of struggles with finding work, others about reconnecting with their families. One older man talked about the nightmares that still haunted him decades after his service. Each story was deeply personal, and Emily found herself growing more and more emotional as she listened. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated. She hadn't planned on saying anything, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I'm not a veteran," she began, her voice shaky. I came here because I made a mistake. I said something to someone, a veteran, and I think I hurt him. I didn't understand what he had been through. I judged him without knowing his story, and now I can't stop thinking about it." The room was silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. The woman who had greeted her earlier gave her an encouraging nod, and Emily continued. "I don't know if he's here, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not just to him, but to everyone here. I've spent my whole life making assumptions about people in the military, and I realize now how wrong I was." Her voice cracked and she looked down at her hands, unsure of what else to say. After a moment, a man across the circle spoke up. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Emily looked up and met his gaze, grateful for his kindness. She stayed for the rest of the meeting, listening to more stories and gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges veterans faced. By the time the meeting ended, the man she was looking for hadn't shown up, but she didn't feel discouraged. She felt hopeful. As she left the community center, she knew her journey wasn't over. She still had to find him, but she was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about making amends. It was about changing the way she saw the world and herself. The next few days passed in a blur for Emily, her thoughts still lingering on the support group meeting. Although the man she had insulted wasn't there, hearing the stories from other veterans had opened her eyes to realities she had never considered. It left her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, a desire to understand, to learn, and to grow from her mistakes. Yet she still felt the lingering pull of unfinished business. She had to find him. On a quiet Saturday morning, Emily decided to take a walk through the park where she often went to clear her head. She had been carrying the flyer from the veteran support group in her bag, glancing at it every now and then like a talisman. As she walked, the brisk autumn air helped calm her nerves. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. She hadn't expected to see him. Yet, as she turned the corner near a bench by the pond, there he was, the man from the café. He sat quietly, much like before, wearing the same faded military jacket, his gaze fixed on the water. For a moment, Emily froze. Her heart raced and her palms began to sweat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, yet now that it was here, she had no idea what to say. She took a deep breath and walked toward him. Her footsteps crunched on the gravel and he turned slightly, noticing her approach. His expression was calm but unreadable, just as it had been in the café. "Hi," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. I don't know if you remember me." His gaze didn't waver. "I remember," he said, his tone even. Emily's cheeks flushed. "I wanted to find you. I owe you an apology for what I said. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." The man studied her for a moment, then gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit," he said simply. She hesitated, then sat down, the cool wood of the bench grounding her. The pond in front of them was serene, ducks gliding across the surface. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to come find me," he said finally. "Most people would have just moved on." Emily shook her head. "I couldn't. What I said to you, it was awful. And it wasn't just about you. It was about the way I've thought about people like you my whole life. I've been so wrong." He nodded slowly, his gaze still on the water. "You said some things that hurt, but I've heard worse. People don't always understand what we go through, and I've learned not to take it personally. But I won't lie, it stays with you." Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I didn't understand. I still don't, not fully. But I want to. I've been going to veteran support meetings, trying to learn. I even went to one this week, hoping you'd be there." That caught his attention. He turned to look at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You went to a meeting." She nodded. "I wanted to understand, to listen. The stories people shared. They broke me. I can't believe how blind I've been." He exhaled deeply as if weighing her words. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. Most people don't bother." Emily looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "I'm trying to do better, but it's not about me. It's about honoring what you and others like you have gone through." The man nodded again, a faint glimmer of something softening his expression. "You're making the effort. That matters." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the pond and the distant chatter of children filling the air. Emily wanted to ask him so many questions, but she didn't want to pry. Finally, he broke the silence. "My name's Matt," he said, extending his hand. "Emily?" she replied, shaking it. His grip was firm but gentle, and she noticed the faint scars that lined his hand. She wondered how many stories those scars held, how much pain he had endured to carry them. "You asked me once if I knew what it meant to wear this jacket," Matt said, his voice calm but steady. "The truth is, it means a lot of things. It means loss. It means responsibility. And sometimes it means survival when others didn't." Emily swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't know," she said softly. "But I want to learn. If you're willing to share." He looked at her for a long moment as if trying to decide if she was sincere. Finally, he nodded. "I'll tell you, but it's not an easy story to hear." "I'm ready," Emily said, her voice steady. "I want to hear it." And so he began. He told her about his time in the military, about the missions that had taken him to the brink of what a human being could endure. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the names tattooed on his wrist. He told her about the day he lost his arm, the chaos and pain of that moment, and the guilt that followed when he survived while others didn't. Emily listened intently, tears streaming down her face at times, but she didn't interrupt. She let his words wash over her, each one peeling back another layer of ignorance she hadn't realized she carried. By the time he finished, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting the park in golden light. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sharing that with me. I can't imagine how hard it must be to talk about." Matt nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's hard, but it's important. People need to understand, not just what we go through, but what we carry with us after." "I'll never forget this," Emily said, "and I'll do better. I promise." Matt stood, brushing off his jacket. That's all anyone can do. As he walked away, Emily sat there for a while staring at the pond. She felt changed, as if something inside her had shifted irreversibly. She didn't know where this journey would lead her, but she knew one thing. She wasn't the same person she had been before. The encounter with Matt lingered in Emily's mind long after she left the park. His words, his scars, his story, they weren't just memories. They were a wake-up call. For the first time in her life, Emily felt compelled to actively challenge her preconceived notions, not just about veterans, but about everything she had taken for granted. She had promised Matt she would do better, and she intended to keep that promise. The next morning, Emily woke up with a new sense of purpose. She decided to return to the veteran support group meeting she had attended earlier in the week. She knew Matt might not be there, but it felt like the right place to start. She arrived early, bringing a tray of cookies she had baked that morning. It was a small gesture, but she hoped it would show her commitment to building bridges. The woman at the door greeted her warmly. "Back again. It's good to see you." Emily smiled shyly. I want to help however I can." The meeting began, and once again, Emily listened as veterans shared their struggles and triumphs. Each story was a window into a world she was only beginning to understand. One man spoke about losing his job because his PTSD made it hard to focus. Another woman shared how her service dog had given her a new lease on life. As the stories unfolded, Emily found herself not just listening, but connecting. She was starting to see these individuals as people, not just symbols of a cause she hadn't understood. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what you've been through," she began, her voice steady, "but I want to try, and I want to help. If there's anything I can do, whether it's volunteering, advocating, or just listening, I'm here." Her words were met with nods of encouragement and a few smiles. One older man approached her after the meeting. "You've got a good heart," he said. "We need more people like you out there, willing to listen." Emily felt a warmth she hadn't expected. She wasn't just making amends, she was building connections. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into learning and helping. She signed up to volunteer at a local veteran outreach program, helping to organize events and fundraisers. She attended workshops to better understand the challenges veterans faced, from mental health struggles to reintegration into civilian life. Every new experience deepened her empathy and strengthened her resolve. Her relationship with Matt also began to grow. After their conversation in the park, they started meeting regularly, sometimes at the same park bench, other times at a quiet café. Matt was guarded at first, but as Emily proved her sincerity, he began to open up. He told her more about his life before and after his service, the good, the bad, and the moments that had defined him. In turn, Emily shared pieces of her own story. She told him about her father, about the opinions she had absorbed without question, and how meeting him had turned her world upside down. Matt listened patiently, offering insights that often left her with more questions than answers. But Emily didn't mind. She was learning to embrace the uncertainty, to sit with discomfort and let it guide her toward growth. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, Matt surprised her with a question. "Why are you doing all this?" Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Because I was wrong," she said simply, "and because I want to be better." Matt nodded thoughtfully. "You already are." His words stayed with her, a quiet affirmation that she was on the right path. But Emily knew her journey was far from over. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she didn't know. There were systemic issues that needed addressing, from the lack of resources for veterans to the stigma surrounding mental health. Emily couldn't fix it all, but she was determined to do her part. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. The veteran support group invited her to speak at one of their fundraisers, sharing her journey and what she had learned. Emily was nervous, but she knew this was an opportunity to make a difference. Standing in front of a room full of strangers, she spoke from the heart. "I used to think I understood the world," she began. "I had strong opinions and no interest in challenging them. But then I met someone who forced me to confront the truth. About him, about myself, and about the assumptions I'd been carrying for years. That person showed me that understanding doesn't come from judging from a distance. It comes from listening, from connecting, from being willing to see the world through someone else's eyes." Her words were met with applause, but more importantly, they sparked conversations. Several people approached her afterward, thanking her for her honesty and asking how they could get involved. Emily realized that change didn't have to come from grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a single conversation. As the weeks turned into months, Emily continued her journey of growth. She and Matt became unlikely friends, their bond rooted in mutual respect and a shared commitment to understanding. Through him, she learned not just about the struggles veterans faced, but about resilience, sacrifice, and the strength of the human spirit. One evening, as they sat by the pond, Matt turned to her and said, "You've come a long way." Emily smiled. "I still have a long way to go." Matt nodded. "Don't we all?" The months that followed were transformative for Emily. What had started as an apology had grown into a personal mission to educate herself and help others understand the sacrifices made by people like Matt. Her conversations with him became a cornerstone of her growth, but it wasn't just about their connection anymore. Emily realized that her journey wasn't only about amends. It was about contributing to a world where others didn't have to carry the burden of ignorance she once held. One cold winter evening, Emily stood in front of a crowded room at a community event organized by the Veteran Support Group. The theme was resilience, and she had been invited to speak. The audience was a mix of veterans, their families, and civilians who had come to learn more. Among them, sitting quietly near the back, was Matt. Taking a deep breath, Emily began. "A few months ago, I made a mistake, a big one. I judged someone without knowing their story, without taking a moment to understand what they'd been through. I said things I regret, things that hurt, and I carried those words with me like a weight. But that moment changed me." She scanned the audience, her gaze briefly meeting Matt's. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. "I've spent these last months trying to unlearn the assumptions I carried and replace them with understanding. And, let me tell you, it hasn't been easy. Listening to the stories of veterans, hearing about the challenges they face, the pain they endure, and the strength they show, it's humbling. It's made me realize how much I took for granted, how much I didn't know." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "The person I insulted is here tonight. He showed me grace when I didn't deserve it. He didn't have to share his story with me, but he did. And that story changed my life. I'll never fully understand what it means to serve, but I promise I'll never stop trying to learn, and I'll never stop sharing what I've learned, so others can understand too." The room erupted in applause, and as Emily stepped off the stage, several people approached her, thanking her for her words. But the moment that meant the most was when Matt walked up to her. He didn't say anything at first, just smiled and shook her hand. "You did good," he said finally. "Thanks to you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Matt chuckled. "Nah, you did this yourself." That night, as Emily walked home, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Her journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time she felt like she was truly making a difference. She wasn't just someone who had made a mistake. She was someone who had learned from it and used it as a springboard to create change. Over time, Emily's efforts grew. She began organizing events and workshops aimed at bridging the gap between veterans and civilians. She collaborated with the Veteran Support Group to create educational programs for schools, teaching students about the realities of service and sacrifice. And through it all, Matt remained a steadfast presence in her life, offering guidance and encouragement. One day, as they sat by the pond in the park where they had reconnected, Matt handed her something, a small worn patch from his jacket. It was one of the unit patches she had learned about during her research. "This belonged to one of my closest friends," Matt said quietly. "He didn't make it back, but I think he'd want someone like you to have it, someone who cares enough to learn." Emily's hands trembled as she accepted the patch. "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," Matt said with a faint smile, "but you've earned it." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she held the patch close. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of trust, of redemption, of everything she had worked to achieve since that fateful day in the café. As the sun set over the pond, Emily realized something profound. Her journey wasn't just about atonement anymore. It was about purpose, about building a world where people like Matt didn't have to carry their stories alone, a world where understanding and compassion replaced judgment and ignorance. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.